Who do you think was Alexander the Great's closest companion? Hephaestion? Think again. There was another name that historians barely mention. A young man whose fate was so horrifying that ancient writers chose to bury his story in the depths of history. His name was Bagoas, a Persian youth, 16 years old, and one of the most beautiful young men of his era. His meeting with Alexander wasn't coincidence. It was an encounter that would forever change the life of the world's most powerful man. But Bagoas's true story isn't just a tale of royal favor. This is the story of how power destroys innocence, how love transforms into obsession, and how even the brightest empires harbor the darkest secrets. If you're fascinated by these hidden stories from history, don't forget to subscribe to Buried Truths and hit that like button. Comment below and let me know where you're watching from. It's incredible how we're exploring these ancient mysteries together, from different corners of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. Picture this: you're a 16-year-old Persian noble, raised in the luxury of Persepolis, educated in poetry, music and the refined arts of the Persian court. Your life has been one of privilege and promise. Then in 3034 BCE, everything changes when the Macedonian army sweeps across your homeland like a devastating storm. Bagoas came from a family of Persian aristocrats who had served the Achaemenid dynasty for generations. He was what the ancients called perfectly formed, not just physically beautiful, but intellectually gifted and culturally sophisticated. In Persian society, such young men were treasured as living embodiments of divine beauty and wisdom. But when Alexander's forces conquered Persepolis, this protected world collapsed overnight. The great palace libraries burned, sending scrolls of ancient wisdom into smoke. Noble families were scattered, their treasures looted, their children taken as spoils of war. Among the captives selected for special attention was the young man whose beauty would captivate the conqueror of the known world. The first meeting between Alexander and Bagoas occurred in the ruins of the very palace where the youth had been raised. Contemporary accounts describe Alexander's immediate fascination, not just with Bagoas's appearance, but with his intelligence and cultural knowledge. Here was someone who could help the Macedonian king understand the sophisticated Eastern world he had conquered. Initially, their relationship seemed almost miraculous. Alexander, barely 24 himself, found in Bagoas both a beautiful companion and an intellectual guide to Persian culture. The young Persian, meanwhile, saw in Alexander a protector who might restore some dignity to his shattered world. Alexander treated Bagoas with a respect that shocked his Macedonian companions. The king sought the youth's advice on Persian customs, listened to his recitations of Persian poetry, and even began adopting some Eastern dress and mannerisms that Bagoas suggested. For a brief shining moment, it seemed like love might bridge the gap between conqueror and conquered. But absolute power has a way of corrupting even the purest emotions. Alexander's affection for Bagoas gradually transformed into something darker and more possessive. What began as respectful admiration evolved into obsessive control. The Macedonian court buzzed with gossip and resentment about their king's Persian favorite. Old guard generals, like Parmenion, openly questioned whether Alexander was becoming too barbarized by his association with Eastern customs and companions. They saw Bagoas not as a person, but as a symbol of their king's dangerous drift away from Macedonian values. Clytus the Black, Alexander's childhood friend and a veteran commander, made his feelings brutally clear during a particularly wine-soaked evening. "That Persian boy is making you soft," he declared. "You're forgetting who you are, forgetting your own people for the sake of a pretty barbarian." When word of this insult reached Alexander, his reaction revealed the depth of his psychological transformation. Instead of punishing Clytus for the disrespect, Alexander blamed Bagoas for provoking jealousy among his men. "Why do you make them hate you?" he demanded. You need to be more careful, more submissive. This response marked a crucial turning point in their relationship. Bagoas began to understand that he wasn't valued as an equal partner, but as a cherished possession that must not upset its owner's other relationships. Love, he learned, could be just another form of slavery. As Alexander's campaigns continued eastward into India, the pressures on both men intensified. The army was stretched thin, supplies were running low, and the constant warfare was taking its toll on Alexander's mental state. In this environment of stress and uncertainty, the king's treatment of Bagoas became increasingly erratic and controlling. Alexander began restricting Bagoas's movements, monitoring his conversations, and demanding to know his whereabouts at all times. What the king called protection, everyone else recognized as imprisonment. Bagoas was no longer a companion. He had become a beautiful bird in a golden cage. The young Persian's letters from this period, preserved in fragmentary form in ancient archives, reveal his growing despair. "I am surrounded by luxury, but starved of freedom," he wrote to a cousin who had escaped to Babylon. "The king's love feels more like chains with each passing day." The breaking point came during the Indian campaign, when exhausted soldiers began questioning Alexander's increasingly grandiose ambitions. In this tense atmosphere, any sign of disloyalty was seen as treason. When Bagoas was observed having a private conversation with Roxana, Alexander's Bactrian wife, paranoid suspicions immediately arose. The conversation itself was innocent. Two foreign-born members of Alexander's inner circle, sharing their homesickness and concerns about the king's increasingly erratic behavior. But to Alexander's spies, it looked like conspiracy. Within hours, both Bagoas and Roxana were under investigation for plotting against the crown. Alexander's confrontation with Bagoas over this alleged betrayal was devastating. The king, who had once listened respectfully to Persian poetry, now screamed accusations of treachery and ingratitude. "I raised you from nothing," he raged. "I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me." Bagoas tried desperately to explain that the conversation had been harmless, but Alexander was beyond reason. Years of unchecked power and mounting paranoia had warped his judgment beyond recognition. In his mind, any private conversation involving his favorites was potential treason. From that day forward, Bagoas lived under constant surveillance. Guards monitored his every movement, scribes recorded his every conversation, and physicians regularly examined him for signs of illness that might indicate poisoning attempts. The golden cage had become a prison of mirrors where privacy no longer existed. The psychological toll was devastating. Bagoas, once vibrant and intellectually curious, became withdrawn and hollow-eyed. Courtiers noticed his rapid weight loss, his nervous habits, and the way he flinched whenever Alexander entered a room. The beautiful youth was withering away before their eyes. Meanwhile, Alexander seemed oblivious to the damage he was inflicting. In his twisted logic, increased surveillance demonstrated increased care. He convinced himself that monitoring Bagoas's every breath was an expression of love rather than control. Other members of Alexander's inner circle watched this deterioration with growing alarm. Hephaestion, the king's oldest friend, privately expressed concerns about Alexander's treatment of the Persian youth. But even he dared not openly challenge the king's increasingly irrational behavior. The tragic irony was that Alexander genuinely loved Bagoas, but his love had been corrupted by absolute power into something unrecognizable. He wanted to possess not just Bagoas's body, but his thoughts, emotions, and very soul. Love without trust had become indistinguishable from torture. As Alexander's health began to decline during his final years, the atmosphere around Bagoas became even more suffocating. The king's approaching mortality made him desperately clingy, while simultaneously paranoid about succession plot. In this toxic environment, Bagoas's mere existence became dangerous. When Alexander finally died in Babylon in 33 BCE, Bagoas's fate was sealed. The Macedonian generals who had resented his influence for years now saw their chance for revenge. Within days of the king's death, Bagoas was arrested on fabricated charges of complicity in Alexander's demise. The trial was a mockery of justice, designed to provide legal cover for what was essentially an execution motivated by years of accumulated resentment. Witnesses testified to conversations they had never heard, plots they had never witnessed, and crimes that had never occurred. Perhaps most heartbreaking was the testimony of former friends who threw Bagoas under the chariot wheels to save themselves. Men who had shared meals with him laughed at his jokes and sought his advice on Persian customs now painted him as a scheming foreign agent who had corrupted their beloved king. Hephaestion, to his credit, refused to participate in the proceedings, but his silence couldn't save his friend. The Macedonian aristocracy had made up its mind. The Persian favorite had to die. When the inevitable death sentence was pronounced, Bagoas showed the dignity that had first attracted Alexander years earlier. His final words, recorded by a sympathetic scribe, were simple but profound. "I loved Alexander truly. That was my crime and my glory." He was executed at dawn on a cool autumn morning, dressed in white Persian robes, according to his family's tradition. He was 22 years old, the same age Alexander had been when they first met. His body was burned on a pyre outside Babylon, and his ashes were scattered to the winds, a final erasure of a life that had briefly blazed at the center of world history. But Bagoas's story didn't end with his death. Over the following centuries, as Alexander's empire fragmented and his successors wrote their own versions of history, the Persian youth's memory became a battleground. Some chroniclers portrayed him as a noble victim of political revenge. Others depicted him as a scheming manipulator who had corrupted their hero. The truth, as always, was more complex and more human. Bagoas had been neither saint nor villain, but simply a young man caught in the machinery of imperial politics and royal obsession. His greatest mistake was being beautiful and intelligent in an age when both qualities could be fatal. Modern historians studying the fragmentary evidence of Bagoas's life see in his story a window into the darker aspects of Alexander's character. The great conqueror's treatment of his Persian favorite reveals the psychological cost of absolute power, how unlimited authority can corrupt even love itself. The surveillance, control, and paranoia that characterized Alexander's final years with Bagoas have disturbing parallels in our contemporary world. Today's technology makes the kind of monitoring that destroyed Bagoas's life seem primitive by comparison. Social media, digital tracking, and algorithmic analysis allow modern obsessors to achieve levels of control that ancient tyrants could only dream of. Yet the fundamental dynamics remain unchanged. Power imbalances in relationships still allow stronger parties to monitor, control, and ultimately destroy the autonomy of those they claim to love. The golden cage has simply been updated with electronic lock. Bagoas's legacy is a warning across the centuries. True love requires freedom, respect, and trust. When affection becomes possession, when protection becomes control, when care becomes surveillance, love dies, even if its victims continue breathing. In the ruins of Persepolis today, archaeologists occasionally uncover fragments of poetry written in the Persian script of Bagoas's era. Though we can never be certain of authorship, some scholars believe these verses might be the work of Alexander's beautiful companion. The nightingale sings sweetest when free, though golden cages shine so bright. Better to die on wing than live, forever prisoners of misguided love. Whether or not Bagoas wrote these lines, they capture the essence of his tragedy. He had been loved by the most powerful man in the world, showered with gifts beyond imagination, and granted access to the highest circles of ancient society. Yet all this privilege came at the cost of his fundamental humanity. His story reminds us that historical narratives often focus on the powerful while ignoring the voices of those they dominated. Every great conquest, every mighty empire, every celebrated ruler's story is built on the silenced experiences of countless individuals like Bagoas, people whose lives were shaped, constrained, and ultimately destroyed by forces beyond their control. Today, as we celebrate the achievements of historical figures like Alexander, we should also remember their victims, not to diminish their accomplishments, but to understand their full human cost. Great men are not always good men, and their greatness often comes at the expense of others' freedom and dignity. The teenage boy who had once recited Persian poetry in the gardens of Persepolis died forgotten in a Babylonian prison cell, his crime being the object of a powerful man's twisted affection. But his memory survives, as a testament to all those whose stories were buried beneath the weight of imperial glory. In remembering Bagoas, we honor not just one young man's tragedy, but the countless unnamed victims of power's corruption throughout history. Their voices, though silenced, still echo across the centuries, reminding us that behind every throne lies a foundation of human suffering that we ignore at our own moral peril. The boy who loved poetry and dreamed of freedom deserved better than to become a footnote in someone else's legend. But perhaps in telling his story now, we can finally grant him the dignity that was denied him in life. The dignity of being remembered not as an object, but as a human being whose brief existence mattered just as much as that of the kings who used and discarded him. This is the buried truth of Bagoas, that love without freedom is not love at all, but just another form of conquest. And in a world where power still corrupts and the vulnerable still suffer for the obsessions of the mighty, his story remains as relevant today as it was 2,000 years ago.